she didn't lose faith overnight. It faded slowly, cup by cup, day by day, as she stood behind the counter of her small cafe watching the hours pass with more silence than customers. The belief that things would work out didn't disappear suddenly. It thinned, worn down by empty chairs and untouched tables. At first, she told herself it was temporary. A slow season. A phase every small business goes through. She adjusted the menu, changed opening hours, posted online, smiled wider. But effort didn't seem to move anything. The door opened less and less, and every quiet morning felt heavier than the last. Running the cafe had once felt like a dream she was proud of. Now it felt like responsibility pressing down on her chest. Rent, suppliers, utilities, all of it depended on customers who simply weren't coming. The space still smelled like fresh coffee, but the energy had changed. She spent long hours wiping the same counter, rearranging the same display, hoping movement would attract movement. Sometimes she caught herself listening too closely for the sound of the door opening, only to feel the familiar disappointment when it didn't. What scared her most wasn't just the lack of clients. It was the growing thought that maybe this wasn't meant to work. That maybe she had believed in something unrealistic. That maybe this dream had an expiration date she was approaching fast. Closing the cafe wasn't something she wanted to imagine, but the possibility hovered constantly. Each slow day whispered the same question: how much longer can I keep this open like this? She didn't say it out loud, but it lived in her thoughts. And slowly, almost without noticing, she began to believe something painful, not that it was hard, but that it might not be possible at all. Every morning, she arrived early, unlocking the door with the same hope she had learned to hide. She turned on the lights, started the machines, and prepared the space as if it were about to fill with life. The ritual stayed intact, even when the results didn't. She needed the cafe to feel ready, even when she didn't. The first hours were always the quietest. She watched the street through the front window, noticing people pass by without stopping. Some glanced in, some didn't look at all. Each step that didn't slow down felt personal, even though she knew it wasn't. She cleaned constantly, not because the cafe was dirty, but because stillness made her uneasy. Wiping tables gave her something to do with her hands while her mind raced. Silence had a way of amplifying every doubt she was trying to ignore. Occasionally, a customer would come in, order a coffee, sit for a few minutes, and leave. Those brief interactions felt almost fragile, like reminders of what the cafe could be, and what it wasn't becoming fast enough. Gratitude mixed with sadness in ways she didn't know how to separate. She began calculating everything. How many cups she needed to sell to cover the day. How many days like this she could afford. The numbers ran quietly in the background of every thought, even when she tried to focus on something else. Friends and family told her to hold on and stay positive, but they didn't see the empty hours. They didn't stand behind the counter listening to a door that rarely opened. Encouragement sounded different when rent was due and suppliers were waiting. By the end of each day, she closed the cafe with a familiar heaviness. Locking the door felt less like ending a shift and more like postponing a decision she wasn't ready to face, whether believing in this dream was still reasonable or simply painful. One afternoon, during a stretch of hours when no one had walked in, she turned on the small television mounted in the corner of the cafe. It wasn't for entertainment. It was to fill the silence that had begun to feel too loud, too personal. The sounds softened the emptiness, even if she wasn't really watching. She went back to cleaning, moving cups, adjusting chairs, doing everything she could to stay busy. The screen flickered in the background, voices blending into noise. She barely noticed what was playing, until a sentence cut through her thoughts and made her stop. The person on the screen was speaking calmly, almost casually, about businesses and people. About how places carry emotional energy. About how fear, even when silent, changes how others experience a space. She stood still, cloth in her hand, listening now. The voice said something that felt uncomfortably close to home: people don't respond to effort alone. They respond to how a place feels. Energy speaks before words do. The sentence landed heavier than she expected. It wasn't judgmental. It was observant. She looked around the cafe differently for the first time in weeks. The chairs. The counter. The quiet air she had grown used to. She wondered what people felt when they stepped inside, not what they saw, but what they sensed. Tension. Worry. Waiting. She realized she had been standing behind the counter every day carrying fear, even when she smiled. Fear of closing. Fear of failure. Fear of believing in something that might not work. And maybe, without meaning to, that fear had been shaping the space itself. She didn't turn off the TV right away. She let the program continue, not because she needed answers, but because something inside her had shifted. For the first time, the problem didn't feel like marketing or location. It felt internal. And that realization stayed with her long after the screen went dark. The words from the television stayed with her longer than she expected. Even after the program ended and the cafe returned to its usual quiet, the idea kept circling in her mind. How a place feels. She repeated the phrase silently while wiping the counter, as if testing its weight. She began noticing details she had ignored before. The way she stood behind the counter, shoulders tense. The way her eyes kept drifting toward the door, waiting. The silence that wasn't just quiet, but heavy with expectation. None of it was intentional, but all of it was present. Without fully understanding why, she tried making small changes. Not to attract customers, but to soften the atmosphere. She played gentler music. Opened the windows slightly. Rearranged a few tables so the space felt less rigid. The cafe looked the same, but something about it felt different to her. She also caught herself adjusting internally. When fear rose, she noticed it instead of letting it run unchecked. She reminded herself to breathe. To move with less urgency. To be present even when no one was watching. It felt awkward at first, almost unnatural. Still, doubt followed closely. She questioned whether any of this mattered. Whether energy could really influence something as practical as foot traffic. Part of her wanted proof before believing. Another part knew she had tried everything else already. That night, after closing, she sat alone at one of the tables and replayed the moment she had stopped cleaning to listen to the TV. The way her body had reacted before her mind did. That reaction felt important. It felt honest. She didn't have answers yet. But she sensed something had been revealed, not a solution, but a direction. And for the first time in a while, she wasn't only thinking about what was going wrong. She was starting to wonder what she might be carrying into the space without realizing it. Over the next few days, she became more aware of herself than of the empty chairs. She started noticing her own thoughts as part of the environment, not something separate from it. Every time fear appeared, what if no one comes today? What if I can't keep this open? She paused instead of letting it spiral unchecked. She realized how often she had been rehearsing failure internally. Standing behind the counter while mentally preparing for the cafe to close. Smiling while expecting disappointment. Hoping, but never fully allowing herself to believe. That contradiction suddenly felt important. The idea from the television resurfaced again and again. Energy speaks before words do. She wondered what message she had been sending without realizing it. Not through marketing or promotions, but through presence. Through emotion. Through expectation. She didn't try to force positivity. That felt dishonest. Instead, she focused on neutrality at first. Calm instead of tension. Openness instead of waiting. She told herself she didn't need to convince anyone, she needed to stop convincing herself that this wouldn't work. Late one evening, after closing the cafe, she sat quietly with a cup of coffee she hadn't rushed to drink. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to imagine the space full, not as a desperate wish, but as a possibility she didn't immediately reject. That moment surprised her. The image didn't trigger fear. It didn't feel unrealistic. It felt unfamiliar, which was different. Unfamiliar didn't mean impossible. It just meant she hadn't practiced holding that idea yet. She sensed she needed a way to make this awareness tangible. Something to slow her thoughts down and give direction to what she was feeling. She didn't know what that tool would be yet, only that staying in her head wasn't enough anymore. That night, after closing the cafe, she didn't go straight home. She stayed a little longer, sitting at one of the tables with the lights dimmed, listening to the quiet hum of the machines cooling down. The space felt different without the pressure of being open. Calm. Neutral. Honest. She realized how quickly her thoughts used to rush when she was alone. Fear filled every empty moment. Now, she noticed a small pause between one thought and the next. It wasn't peace yet, but it was space. And that space felt important. On impulse, she pulled a notebook from her bag, one she normally used for inventory and supplier notes. She placed it on the table and stared at the blank page longer than she expected. Writing had always helped her organize practical things. Maybe it could help organize what was happening inside her too. At first, she didn't try to change anything. She simply wrote what she was noticing. How tense she felt during the day. How often she expected no one to come in. How heavy that expectation felt inside her chest. Seeing those thoughts written down made them feel less overwhelming and more observable. Then she remembered the image she had allowed herself to imagine, the cafe full, alive, moving. Slowly, she turned the page. Not to deny reality, but to choose a different internal direction. Her pen hovered for a moment before touching the paper. She wrote a simple sentence, almost experimentally. This cafe feels welcoming and alive. Reading it back felt strange, but not uncomfortable. It didn't feel like a lie. It felt like a direction. She closed the notebook gently and stood up to leave. Nothing dramatic had happened. The cafe was still quiet. The challenges were still there. But she had taken one small, intentional step towards shaping how she showed up, and for the first time, that felt like something she could build on. The next morning, she arrived at the cafe with the notebook still in her bag. She didn't take it out right away. She went through her usual routine first, unlocking the door, turning on the lights, preparing the machines. But something about the way she moved felt different. Less rushed. Less defensive. Before opening, she sat for a moment at one of the tables and opened the notebook again. The sentence she had written the night before was still there. This cafe feels welcoming and alive. She read it slowly, letting it settle instead of questioning it. She added another line beneath it, carefully choosing her words. People feel comfortable here. Then, after a brief pause, the right clients find their way to this place. Writing those sentences didn't feel like hope. It felt like intention. Throughout the day, she noticed how often her thoughts tried to pull her back into doubt. Each time it happened, she returned mentally to the phrases she had written. She didn't argue with fear. She redirected her focus gently, again and again. By the afternoon, she realized something subtle but important. She was no longer standing behind the counter waiting for disappointment. She was present. Available. Her body language had softened, and she caught herself breathing more deeply between tasks. The cafe was still quiet that day. No sudden rush of customers. No dramatic change. But the atmosphere felt lighter to her, and that mattered. She wasn't measuring success by numbers anymore, she was observing alignment. That evening, before closing, she wrote one last line in the notebook. "I believe in the life of this place." The sentence stayed with her as she locked the door, not as a wish, but as a commitment she was finally allowing herself to make. The change didn't arrive as a rush of customers or a sudden turnaround. It arrived quietly, in ways that were easy to overlook if she hadn't been paying attention. A passerby slowed down at the window. Someone stepped inside just to ask about the menu. Small movements that hadn't happened in days. She noticed how her body reacted first. Instead of tensing up, she stayed open. She smiled naturally, not out of obligation, but out of presence. The interaction felt lighter, more fluid, even when it lasted only a few minutes. Later that morning, another person came in, ordered a coffee, and sat by the window longer than expected. They looked comfortable. Unrushed. It wasn't about the sale, it was about the feeling that the space was finally being used again. She resisted the urge to label it as coincidence. Not because she wanted to believe something magical was happening, but because she recognized a pattern beginning to form. The cafe felt less invisible. Less closed off. As if it had started speaking again. During a quiet moment, she opened the notebook briefly and added a new line. "People are drawn to this space." The words felt calmer now, less experimental, more familiar. What struck her most was how little effort it took to stay aligned once she noticed the shift. She wasn't forcing energy or trying to perform positivity. She was simply present, allowing the atmosphere she had been practicing internally to exist outwardly. By the end of the day, she realized something important. Even before the numbers changed, the relationship between her and the cafe had. And that change was beginning to invite the world back in, one small moment at a time. Over the next few days, the small moments continued. Not consistently enough to feel safe, but often enough to feel intentional. One customer became two. A familiar face returned. Someone recommended the cafe to a friend who walked in saying they had felt curious about the place. She began to notice patterns instead of isolated events. The door opening at times it usually stayed closed. Conversations lasting longer. People lingering instead of rushing out. The space felt engaged again, as if it were being noticed after a long period of being overlooked. What surprised her most was how natural it felt. She wasn't chasing clients or pushing promotions. She was simply there, attentive, calm, available. The cafe no longer felt like something she was trying to save. It felt like something she was allowing to breathe again. Each evening, she returned to the notebook. The journal manifestation was no longer just a place for intention, it had become a record of movement. One night she wrote, "This place is supported." Then added, "People feel good when they are here." The words felt less like affirmations and more like observations. Doubts still appeared, but it no longer controlled her reactions. When fear whispered that it could all stop again, she acknowledged it and returned to presence. She had learned not to collapse into anticipation of loss before anything had actually gone wrong. She realized that believing it wasn't possible had once shaped everything. It had influenced how she stood, how she waited, how she showed up. Now, believing that a new reality could form was shaping her actions just as powerfully. And slowly, unmistakably, she understood something profound. This wasn't luck warming up. This was alignment holding long enough for reality to begin responding. By the end of that week, the cafe no longer felt fragile. It wasn't full yet, but it wasn't empty either. There was a steady rhythm forming, footsteps at the door, voices overlapping, cups being placed on tables that had sat untouched for too long. The space felt awake again. She noticed how different her mornings felt. Instead of bracing herself for silence, she arrived curious. Curious about who might walk in. Curious about how the day would unfold. That curiosity replaced the dread she had lived with for so long. Customers began to stay longer. Some brought laptops. Others sat talking quietly, treating the cafe as a place to settle rather than pass through. A few even commented on how peaceful the atmosphere felt, though they couldn't quite explain why. Each comment reinforced what she had been practicing internally. Energy wasn't abstract anymore, it was observable. People didn't just come for coffee. They came for how the place made them feel. The realization felt grounding, almost obvious in hindsight. At night, she continued writing in her journal manifestation, not to call clients in, but to stay aligned with what was happening. One entry read, "This cafe is becoming what it was always meant to be." Another followed naturally. "I allow growth to feel safe." She was careful not to rush the process. She didn't raise expectations prematurely or assume everything was solved. She stayed present, trusting the rhythm that had begun to form instead of forcing it to accelerate. And with each passing day, the belief that it wasn't possible loosened its grip. In its place, something quieter but stronger took root, the sense that a new reality wasn't coming. It was already unfolding. As the days went on, consistency replaced uncertainty. The cafe developed a pulse, not loud, not overwhelming, but reliable. She could sense it in the way mornings unfolded and in how afternoons no longer stretched endlessly. Time felt different when it wasn't filled with waiting. She noticed herself making decisions from a calmer place. Restocking supplies without fear. Planning the week without immediately calculating how much she might lose. These small acts felt significant because they came from trust instead of survival. The journal manifestation remained part of her routine, not as something she depended on desperately, but as something that kept her centered. One morning she wrote, "I trust the flow of this place." Later that night, she added, "Growth feels safe to receive." The words reflected a mindset she was actively living. Customers began recognizing her. Returning faces greeted her by name. Some mentioned how they liked the atmosphere, how it felt easy to be there. Hearing that confirmed what she had sensed internally, the cafe was no longer carrying tension. She realized how much of her previous struggle had been internal. Not the work, not the effort, but the constant belief that failure was inevitable. That belief had shaped everything. Letting it go had reshaped the same reality without changing the location or the coffee. What stood out most was how natural this all felt now. There was no adrenaline rush, no disbelief. Just a steady sense that she was finally aligned with what she had created. The cafe felt like an extension of her again, alive, responsive, open. And with that realization came a quiet confidence. Not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that stays. She no longer questioned whether this dream was possible. She was living inside the answer. One afternoon, during a moment of calm between customers, she paused behind the counter and simply observed the cafe. Not as someone waiting for something to happen, but as someone witnessing what already was. The chairs were occupied. Conversations flowed softly. The space felt grounded, alive, and used, not staged, not forced. She realized how different this felt from the weeks when she had believed it wasn't possible. Back then, she had been standing in the same place, looking at the same walls, serving the same coffee. The only thing that had truly changed was the internal state she carried into the room every day. The memory of that belief, "This won't work," felt distant now. Not because she had erased it, but because it no longer made sense in the present moment. Reality had gently contradicted it, not with drama, but with consistency. That evening, she opened the journal manifestation and reread earlier pages. The sentences that once felt hopeful now felt factual. People are drawn to this space. This cafe is supported. She smiled softly, recognizing how intention had slowly turned into experience. She added a new line, one that surprised her by how natural it felt. "I allow success to feel normal." There was no tension in the words. No hesitation. Just recognition. She understood then that manifestation wasn't about controlling outcomes. It was about becoming emotionally available for what you once believed was out of reach. The cafe hadn't changed its location or its offerings, it had changed its relationship with her. And in that clarity, she felt something settle deeply inside her. This wasn't a temporary upswing. This was a new baseline. A new reality she had already stepped into, calmly, consciously, and fully present. One afternoon, during a brief pause between customers, she found herself standing still behind the counter, simply watching the cafe exist. Not waiting. Not hoping. Just observing. The sound of cups being set down, low conversations filling the air, footsteps moving naturally through the space. The cafe no longer felt like something she had to convince people to enter. It felt chosen. She noticed how her body responded to that realization. There was no tension in her shoulders, no tightness in her chest. She wasn't bracing for the next quiet hour or calculating how long the movement would last. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't preparing for disappointment in advance. Her thoughts drifted back to the weeks when she had stood in the same place feeling invisible, watching time pass with almost no interruption. Back then, the silence had felt accusatory, as if the cafe itself were confirming her fears. Now, that memory felt distant, not erased, but softened by contrast. She understood something important in that moment. The space hadn't changed first, she had. The walls, the tables, the coffee were the same. What shifted was the emotional state she brought into the room every single day. Fear had once filled the cafe before any customer could. Now, presence had taken its place. That evening, after closing, she sat at one of the tables and opened the journal manifestation slowly, with intention. She reread earlier entries, noticing how cautious her words had been in the beginning. How tentative. How carefully she had allowed herself to believe. The pages told the story of a gradual internal shift, not a sudden leap. She turned to a new page and wrote something that felt both simple and profound. I allow success to feel normal here. She paused, letting the sentence settle. There was no rush of emotion. No doubt arguing back. Just quiet acceptance. In that stillness, she recognized the truth she had been slowly living into. This wasn't a lucky phase or a temporary surge. This was a new baseline. A new reality formed not by force, but by alignment held consistently over time. And she knew, deeply, that she was no longer standing at the edge of possibility, she was living inside it. As the cafe continued to fill more consistently, she became aware of a new internal challenge, not fear of failure, but fear of trusting what was working. Part of her still expected things to slow down again, as if success were something temporary she had to be cautious with. That realization surprised her. She noticed how easily the old habit of vigilance tried to return. When a quiet moment appeared between customers, her mind instinctively asked if it was the beginning of another decline. This time, instead of reacting, she observed the thought. It no longer carried the same authority. She reminded herself that stability didn't mean constant noise or non-stop movement. It meant flow, moments of activity followed by moments of rest. The cafe didn't need to be full every second to be alive. That understanding softened something deep inside her. In the evenings, she continued writing in the journal manifestation, not to ask for more clients, but to anchor trust. One night she wrote slowly, deliberately. I trust what is working. The sentence felt important, almost like a boundary she was setting with her past fears. She reflected on how different her relationship with the cafe had become. Before, it had felt like something she was fighting to keep alive. Now, it felt like a partnership. She showed up present and grounded, and the space responded in its own rhythm. Customers noticed the change too. Some commented on how the cafe felt calm, how they enjoyed staying longer, how it had become a place they returned to without thinking twice. Hearing that reinforced what she already sensed internally. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider that this new reality wasn't fragile. It didn't need to be protected by fear. It needed to be supported by consistency, and she was finally learning how to do that. Growth didn't announce itself loudly. It unfolded quietly, through repetition. A customer bringing a friend. Someone mentioning the cafe on social media without being asked. Small gestures that accumulated over time and created movement she no longer had to chase. She noticed how little she was doing to attract this growth in the traditional sense. No urgent promotions. No desperate changes. What she was doing was maintaining the emotional state she had practiced, calm, openness, trust. The rest seemed to respond naturally. The cafe began developing a sense of rhythm she hadn't experienced before. Certain hours grew consistently busy. Certain tables were chosen again and again. Familiar faces returned with ease, not obligation. The space felt chosen rather than discovered. In her journal manifestation, her writing evolved again. The affirmations became less about drawing something in and more about sustaining what had arrived. One entry read, "This place grows naturally and steadily." Another followed, "I allow expansion without pressure." The words reflected a mindset she was actively living. She realized that effort hadn't disappeared, it had changed form. Instead of forcing outcomes, she was tending to alignment. Instead of worrying about numbers, she was staying present with people. That shift made the work feel lighter, even when the days were full. Occasionally, she caught herself remembering the time she had believed this wasn't possible. That memory no longer carried pain. It carried contrast. It reminded her how far she had moved internally to reach this point. Standing behind the counter one afternoon, listening to the hum of conversations and the rhythm of the machines, she felt a quiet certainty settle in. This wasn't momentum she needed to protect. It was a flow she could trust, because it was rooted in something deeper than effort alone. As the cafe continued to thrive, she began to notice a subtle but profound shift in how she saw herself. She was no longer someone trying to keep a business alive day by day. She had stepped into the identity of someone who held a space, with intention, confidence, and calm authority. That realization didn't come with a dramatic moment. It arrived quietly, through repetition. Through mornings that no longer felt heavy. Through decisions that felt clear instead of urgent. Through the way she spoke about the cafe without hesitation or apology. She noticed how differently she interacted with customers now. She wasn't scanning their faces for validation or worrying about whether they would return. She was present, attentive, and relaxed. That presence changed the dynamic. Conversations felt natural. Connections felt genuine. In the journal manifestation, her writing reflected this internal evolution. One evening, she wrote, "I lead this space with confidence and ease." Reading it back, she realized she wasn't trying to become that person anymore. She already was. She thought back to the days when she had stood behind the counter questioning whether she should close the doors. That version of herself felt distant, not forgotten, but integrated. The fear that once defined her decisions no longer had a voice strong enough to guide her. What replaced it wasn't arrogance or certainty that nothing could go wrong. It was trust. Trust in her ability to respond, to adjust, to realign if necessary. That trust made her resilient in a way she hadn't been before. And in that grounded sense of self, she recognized the truth she had been living into all along. She hadn't just manifested more clients. She had manifested a new relationship with her business, and with herself. With this new sense of identity came a deeper calm. She no longer measured the cafe's success hour by hour, or day by day. She trusted the rhythm that had been established, understanding that movement didn't need to be constant to be real. Stability, she realized, had its own quiet language. She noticed how her body had changed along with her mindset. The tension she once carried in her shoulders had softened. Her breath moved more freely. Even during busy moments, she remained present instead of overwhelmed. The cafe felt like an extension of that internal balance. There were still challenges, of course. Supplies needed managing. Schedules needed adjusting. Unexpected issues still arose. But none of it felt threatening anymore. Problems became practical matters to solve, not signs that everything was about to fall apart. In the evenings, when the cafe finally quieted down, she returned to the journal manifestation with a different intention. No longer to shift fear, but to maintain alignment. One night she wrote slowly, "I sustain what I have created with trust." The words felt steady, rooted in lived experience. She reflected on how subtle the transformation had been. There was no single moment she could point to and say, "This is when everything changed." Instead, change had woven itself through her days, her thoughts, and her presence until the old reality no longer fit. The belief that it wasn't possible had once limited every decision she made. Now, that belief felt incompatible with who she had become. Not because success had erased doubt completely, but because doubt no longer defined her actions. Standing in the cafe one evening, lights dimmed and chairs stacked, she felt a quiet gratitude rise within her. Not just for the clients who now filled the space, but for the internal shift that had allowed this new reality to take shape, naturally, steadily, and without force. It was only after things had stabilized that she was able to see the full picture. When she finally had space to reflect, she recognized that what had changed wasn't just the number of clients, it was the emotional state she had been living in before and the one she had chosen to shift into. The contrast was impossible to ignore. She thought back to the moment the television had been playing in the background, when a sentence about energy and presence had interrupted her routine. At the time, she hadn't named it as anything specific. Now, she understood. That was her first real encounter with the law of attraction, not as a concept, but as an experience. She saw clearly how fear had shaped her previous reality. How standing behind the counter expecting emptiness had quietly reinforced it. How believing it wasn't possible had influenced everything from her posture to her decisions. The cafe had been reflecting her internal state all along. What followed wasn't magic or coincidence. It was alignment practiced consistently. Awareness replacing automatic fear. Intention replacing resignation. Through the journal manifestation, she had given form to that shift, anchoring it day after day instead of letting it remain abstract. She realized that manifestation hadn't required forcing belief or denying difficulty. It had required honesty, seeing what she was carrying, and choice, deciding to live in a different emotional space. That choice, repeated, had changed how others experienced the cafe. The law of attraction no longer felt mysterious or distant. It felt practical, grounded, woven into daily life. It wasn't about controlling people or outcomes. It was about shaping the internal environment from which everything else responded. And with that understanding came a quiet sense of empowerment. She hadn't been saved by circumstances. She had participated consciously in creating a new reality, one aligned thought, one intentional page, one present moment at a time. As time passed, she noticed something she hadn't expected. She stopped checking for signs that things might fall apart again. The habit of scanning for loss, once so automatic, no longer ran quietly in the background of her thoughts. She wasn't guarding her success. She was living inside it. That absence of vigilance felt unfamiliar at first. There were moments when she caught herself waiting for the old anxiety to return, almost out of habit. But instead of tension, there was steadiness. Instead of bracing, there was presence. The cafe moved through its days without needing her fear to hold it together. She understood then that her nervous system had changed along with her circumstances. Stability wasn't something she was borrowing temporarily. It was something her body recognized as safe now. That realization brought a deeper sense of peace than any busy day ever could. In the evenings, when she opened the journal manifestation, her writing reflected that integration. The pages were no longer about calling something in or protecting it from leaving. They were about embodiment. One night, she wrote slowly and deliberately. "This reality feels natural to me." The words didn't feel aspirational. They felt descriptive. She noticed how easily gratitude replaced calculation. Instead of tallying what might go wrong, she observed what was working. The flow of customers. The warmth of conversations. The quiet satisfaction of a space that felt used, appreciated, alive. The belief that this wasn't possible no longer fit anywhere in her life. It had no place to land. Not because it had been argued away, but because reality itself had outgrown it. The cafe no longer reflected that belief, and neither did she. Standing behind the counter one evening, listening to the soft hum of voices and the rhythm of the machines, she felt a calm certainty settle in. This wasn't something she was waiting to lose. This was something she had become ready to live with, fully, calmly, and without fear. Looking back, she could finally understand why believing it wasn't possible had felt so convincing at the time. It wasn't because she lacked ability or effort. It was because fear had quietly shaped the way she interpreted everything around her. Empty chairs had once felt like verdicts. Silence had felt like confirmation. Now, those same elements simply felt like moments, neutral, temporary, uncharged. She recognized how deeply her identity had been tied to the struggle. For a long time, she had seen herself as someone trying to prove that her dream deserved to exist. That constant need to prove had drained her far more than the work itself. Letting go of that mindset had freed energy she didn't realize she was spending every day. The cafe had become a mirror of that internal shift. It no longer reflected effort mixed with anxiety. It reflected presence, openness, and ease. People felt that difference before they ever tasted the coffee. They responded to what the space communicated without words. Through the journal manifestation, she had learned to notice herself in real time. To recognize when old thoughts tried to return and gently redirect them. That practice didn't make her immune to doubt, it made her resilient. Doubt could appear without taking over. She realized that manifestation wasn't about creating something from nothing. It was about allowing what already wanted to form to finally take shape. The cafe had always had potential. She had simply needed to align with it emotionally instead of standing in its way. What felt most empowering wasn't the success itself, but the understanding that she could participate consciously in her reality. She wasn't waiting for permission anymore. She wasn't asking if it was possible. She was responding to what was already happening. And in that awareness, she felt something settle deeply inside her. This new reality wasn't fragile. It wasn't borrowed time. It was the natural result of alignment held long enough to become real. Standing there at the end of another full day, she realized how quietly her life had shifted. There was no single moment she could point to as the beginning or the end of the transformation. No dramatic rescue. No sudden miracle. Just a gradual crossing from one internal state into another, from doubt into trust, from fear into presence. She understood now that believing something wasn't possible had once shaped her reality just as powerfully as believing in it later did. The cafe had responded to her internal world all along. When she expected emptiness, it mirrored that expectation. When she allowed herself to hold a different emotional state, the space responded in kind. The law of attraction no longer felt like a concept she had learned. It felt like something she had lived. It wasn't about forcing outcomes or controlling people. It was about recognizing that her inner environment was always speaking, and learning to choose what it communicated. The journal manifestation remained part of her life, not as a reminder of struggle, but as a tool of alignment. Each page carried proof of how awareness, intention, and consistency could quietly reshape reality over time. Writing had helped her stay present long enough for change to take root. She no longer asked herself whether this success would last. That question had lost its relevance. Instead, she trusted her ability to remain aligned, to notice when fear tried to return, and to choose differently again. That trust felt deeper than certainty ever could. The cafe, once on the edge of closing, now existed as a reflection of who she had become, grounded, open, and confident in her place. It wasn't just a business that survived. It was a space that transformed alongside her. And if there was one truth her journey revealed, it was this: the moment she stopped believing it wasn't possible, a new reality finally had room to emerge.